Okay, so, everybody's talking about the geopolitical scene in Europe right now.
Yeah.
What with Trump's second inauguration and the World Economic Forum going on in Davos.
Yeah, definitely a lot going on.
We've got some great material to cover all that, some fresh articles from La France Press and the New York Times.
Great sources.
So let's dive in and, try to figure out how all this is.
Yeah, how it's all shaken out.
How it's all shaking out, how the global power dynamics between the U.S. and China and Russia are putting the squeeze on Europe.
For sure.
And we'll also hear from some big names, too.
Oh, yeah.
Like former French Foreign Minister Hubert Védrine.
Okay.
And Trump's former advisor, John Bolton.
Interesting.
And
some analysts?
Yeah, analysts like Zaki Laïdi and Liana Fix.
Okay, well, Europe's definitely in a tough spot.
Yeah.
With the U.S. and China.
Yeah.
These economic giants kind of going head to head.
Right.
And then you've got Russia throwing its weight around, too.
Yeah, Landau from La France Press, he really doesn't hold back at all. He says that Europe is the weakest link in the capitalist chain. And he's actually echoing Lenin's analysis of pre-revolution Russia there.
Wow. That's a
pretty big statement.
Yeah.
What do you think he means by that?
Well,
and is it a fair assessment of Europe's situation right now?
Well, Landau is pointing to the economic strain that Europe is under.
Yeah.
Especially compared to the U.S. and China.
Right.
He talks about how energy prices in Europe are just sky high.
Yeah, I saw that.
Like 3 to 4 times higher.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And, that puts European businesses at a real disadvantage.
Huge disadvantage.
And remember, we're talking about a region that really depends on manufacturing and exports.
Exactly.
So it's a big deal.
Yeah, they're trying to compete, but it's like they've got these weights strapped to their ankles.
Yeah. I like that analogy.
And then on top of all that, you've got this big wild card.
Yeah.
Trump is back in the White House.
Uh-huh.
And
how is that playing out?
Well, Erlanger from the New York Times, he compares Trump's return to like an asteroid heading for Earth.
An asteroid?
Yeah. So all this unpredictability.
Oh, yeah.
With his talk of tariffs and possible annexations.
Annexations? Like what?
Well, he's mentioned Canada.
Oh, wow.
Greenland, the Panama Canal. I mean, it's got to be sending shockwaves through Europe.
You think? I bet they're freaking out a little.
I think so.
Yeah, that asteroid analogy is pretty spot on.
Yeah.
I mean, it really captures the uncertainty around Trump being back.
Right.
What he did during his first term.
Uh-huh.
Especially, how he just disregarded multilateralism. I mean, that really strained transatlantic relations.
For sure.
And now, Europe's dealing with its own economic anxieties.
Right.
And facing all this pressure from Russia and China.
Exactly.
And then you throw Trump's reelection into the mix.
It's a mess.
It really complicates an already volatile situation.
Yeah. And then there's the elephant in the room.
What's that?
The war in Ukraine.
Oh, right. Of course.
Erlanger thinks it's going to be the main thing everyone's talking about at Davos.
Makes sense.
Especially since Trump wants to see it resolved quickly.
Yeah. I read that.
But Putin seems to be digging in for the long haul.
So we have this kind of standoff then?
Seems like it, yeah.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I think the key is to figure out what Putin is really after.
Okay, yeah. What are his objectives?
Well, Erlanger's sources, they say that Putin wants to neutralize Ukraine.
Right.
And, kind of reshape the European security landscape.
How so?
Well, by weakening NATO.
Okay.
And ultimately trying to assert Russia's dominance in the region.
So basically he wants to call all the shots.
Exactly.
That's not good.
And that kind of brings us back to Landau's weakest link argument.
How so?
Well, if Europe is struggling economically already,
right,
and dealing with all these internal divisions, then a long war in Ukraine could really destabilize the region even further.
I see what you're saying.
And make it even more vulnerable.
To Russia.
To Russia, yeah, and to China.
Okay, so Putin could really exploit this situation then.
Exactly. And then if you look at what's happening with Zelensky, Erlanger reports that Zelensky is shifting his stance a bit.
Really? How so?
Well, he's not focused so much on getting back all of Ukraine's territory.
Okay.
He's more interested in getting guarantees for Ukraine's future.
Interesting. So that might mean he's more open to negotiations.
Yeah, it could.
But the big question is, what kind of peace deal would actually satisfy Putin?
Right.
What would he demand?
And how would that impact Europe's security?
Big questions.
Big questions. And
Erlanger quotes Liana Fix.
Yeah.
Who says that Putin thinks he's in a strong position, even though Russia's economy is facing some headwinds.
Right. Do you think that's an accurate assessment?
I think it's definitely worth considering.
Yeah.
I mean, Putin's managed to keep Russia's economy going despite the sanctions. That's true.
And he's clearly willing to play the long game.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to be in any hurry.
Not at all. And he's drawn some very clear red lines.
Like what?
Well, he's said that Ukraine can't join NATO.
Right.
And that there have to be limits on Ukraine's military.
So basically, he wants to control Ukraine's future.
Pretty much.
Well, Erlanger quotes another analyst,
okay,
Norbert Röttgen.
All right.
And Röttgen is really worried about Putin's ambitions.
Okay.
He thinks Putin wants to do more than just control Ukraine.
Oh, really? Like what?
He thinks Putin wants to reshape the whole European security architecture.
Wow. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is. And he says the future of Europe is a matter of its security.
That's a powerful statement.
It really is.
And kind of ominous, too.
Yeah, it is. I mean, what do you make of that statement?
Well, it definitely...
And how does that tie back to all the challenges Europe is facing?
Yeah, I think that's something we should definitely dive into.
Go to do that. It really highlights the seriousness of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Europe's facing a real threat to its security.
Yeah.
And the war in Ukraine has just exposed all these vulnerabilities that they can't ignore anymore.
Right. And Erlanger points out that there are divisions within Europe, too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, about how serious the threat from Russia really is.
Okay.
And how much they should be investing in defense.
That makes sense. And some countries are probably more worried than others.
Exactly. And that lack of unity makes it harder for Europe to stand up to the pressure from the U.S.
What kind of pressure?
Well, you know, the U.S. wants Europe to take on more responsibility.
For Ukraine.
Yeah, for Ukraine and for their own security.
And Europe's not exactly in the best position to do that right now.
Exactly. They're dealing with economic problems and supporting their social welfare systems.
These are really important to them.
Yeah, Londo talked about that.
He did.
But then you've got people like Mark Rutte.
Who's he?
He's the new Secretary General of NATO.
Okay.
And he's calling for a wartime mindset.
Wow, a wartime mindset.
Yeah. And he wants European countries to seriously boost their military spending.
How much are we talking?
He's saying at least 3 to 3.5% of their GDP.
That's a big jump.
Huge. And, you know, a lot of countries are going to resist that.
I bet. Especially those who prioritize social spending.
Yeah, or those who just don't think Russia is that big of a threat.
Which is probably a mistake.
Yeah, it probably is. But the thing is, Erlanger also mentions that Trump isn't really focused on Europe right now.
No. So what is he focused on?
Well, he seems more interested in confronting China.
Okay, so basically he's leaving Europe to fend for themselves.
Pretty much. And Erlanger quotes Röttgen again. And Röttgen says that with Trump back in charge, Europe's on its own when it comes to security.
And what does he think about that?
Well, he doesn't think Europe is ready for that responsibility.
So what are their options then? How can they ensure Ukraine's security?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
And what are the experts saying?
Well, they talk about things like NATO membership.
For Ukraine?
Yeah, but that's probably not going to happen anytime soon.
Why not?
Well, everyone in NATO has to agree.
Right.
And some countries like France and Germany aren't on board.
Makes sense. I mean, that would be a huge escalation.
It would. And then there's the idea of EU membership.
For Ukraine?
Right. But Erlanger says that's a long way off.
Why?
Well, it's a really complicated process.
I can imagine.
It involves all sorts of political and economic and legal reforms.
Yeah.
And Ukraine has a lot of work to do in areas like corruption and the rule of law.
Okay, so even if everyone wanted it to happen, it would take years, maybe even decades.
Exactly. And then there's the idea of European peacekeeping forces.
Okay, so European troops on the ground in Ukraine.
Right, but Erlanger points out all the logistical and political problems with that.
Yeah, that would be a nightmare to coordinate.
Totally. And even if they could pull it off,
right,
would it actually stop Russia from attacking again?
That's a good question.
And wouldn't it risk making the conflict even worse?
Possibly.
Erlanger actually quotes Charles Kupchan.
Who's that?
He worked in the Obama administration.
Okay. And
Kupchan says that the U.S. is pursuing a policy without a strategy in Ukraine.
Interesting. What does he mean by that?
Well, he thinks the U.S. is just giving Ukraine unlimited support.
Yeah.
But without really defining what they want to achieve.
So no clear objectives.
No, and no plan for how to get there.
What's the problem with that?
Well, Kupchan says it could lead to mission creep.
Meaning?
Meaning the U.S. gets dragged deeper and deeper into the conflict.
Okay.
And the war just drags on and on.
And then Ukraine is the one who suffers.
Exactly. It could end up as a failed state.
Stuck in this endless cycle of war and instability.
Exactly. And even if they manage to get a ceasefire, Erlanger says the biggest challenge is still there.
Which is?
How to guarantee Ukraine's security in the future.
And no one seems to have a good answer for that.
Nope. And to make matters worse, Erlanger says that some people, maybe even Trump himself, are saying that Europe should take the lead on Ukraine's security.
Wow, really?
Yeah. What do you think about that idea?
Well, it's complicated.
Yeah, I bet.
I mean, it might sound good to people who want the U.S. to pull back.
Right.
But can Europe actually handle that responsibility?
That's the big question.
And are they even willing to?
We're talking about potentially sending thousands of European troops to Ukraine.
Yeah. And Erlanger says there's a lot of resistance to that idea.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I mean, it could provoke Russia even more.
And then there's the fact that not all European countries agree on the threat from Russia.
Right. Erlanger mentioned that Poland, for example, they're really worried about Russia.
Understandably so, given their history.
Exactly. So how can Europe present a united front when they can't even agree on the basics? That's the challenge, isn't it?
It is. They need to figure out how to bridge those internal divisions and come up with a real strategy for dealing with Russia.
Otherwise, they're just going to be reacting to events
instead of shaping them.
Right. They'll be at Russia's mercy.
Exactly. So basically, Europe is stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, they're getting pressure from the U.S. and Russia.
Right.
And they're trying to deal with their own internal divisions and economic problems.
It's a tough spot to be in.
It really is. And it all goes back to Landau's point.
The weakest link.
Yeah. Is Europe really the weakest link?
And if they are, what can they do to change that?
I think that's the question we need to keep asking.
Let's keep digging. Yeah, it really feels like Europe is at a turning point. Like they really need to take charge if they don't want to be the weakest link.
Yeah, for sure. But what would that even look like?
That's the question, isn't it?
I mean, it's a tough one.
It is.
One thing that's really important is for Europe to be more united.
Yeah.
You know, they need a stronger sense of shared purpose.
Right. Erlanger talked about how divided Europe is.
He did.
And those divisions need to be addressed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If Europe wants to be a real player on the world stage, they need to speak with one voice.
That's easier said than done, though, right?
For sure.
We're talking about 27 different countries.
Right.
Each with its own history and priorities and political views.
Totally. I mean, how can they possibly agree on something as complicated as foreign policy?
Exactly. It seems almost impossible.
It's definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
But if Europe wants to be taken seriously, they need to think bigger, you know?
Okay.
They need to move beyond their own individual interests.
And focus on the bigger picture.
Exactly. A stronger and more unified Europe is in everyone's best interest.
Okay, so let's say they actually manage to do that.
Right.
What concrete steps can they take to make themselves stronger in this global power struggle?
Well, defense is obviously a big one.
Right. Root was talking about increasing military spending.
He was. But it's not just about spending more money.
So what is it about?
It's about having a smarter defense strategy.
Okay.
One that allows Europe to act on its own when it needs to.
Right.
And to be a real partner to NATO.
So basically, they need to be able to pull their own weight.
Exactly. And then there's the economic side of things.
Right. Landau is pretty pessimistic about Europe's economic vulnerabilities.
Yeah, especially when it comes to energy.
Yeah, their dependence on Russia is a real problem.
It is. They need to find other sources of energy.
Like what?
Well, they need to invest in renewable energy.
Okay.
And improve energy efficiency.
Let's hear energy go further.
Right. And they need to look for new suppliers.
So not just relying on Russia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a long process.
Right.
But it's essential if they want to be more secure.
So they need to be strong militarily and economically.
Right. And they also need to be smart about their alliances.
Yeah. If Europe wants to be a player in this multipolar world, they can't just go it alone.
No. They need strong partners.
And who are those partners?
Well, the U.S. is still important, even with Trump. But they also need to build relationships with other countries.
Like who?
Well, China, for one.
Okay.
And India and countries in the global south.
So basically, they need to diversify their portfolio.
Exactly. They need to be more pragmatic and flexible in their foreign policy.
Okay, so it sounds like Europe has a lot of work to do.
They do, but it's not impossible.
And if they get it right, what could it mean for their future?
Well, if they can overcome their divisions,
right,
and strengthen their defenses and diversify their economy, and build strong partnerships, they could become a truly independent and influential force.
Wow. So not just surviving, but actually thriving.
Exactly. They could help shape global norms.
Okay.
And promote peace and security.
Yeah.
And tackle big challenges like climate change.
So basically, they could become a leader on the world stage.
Exactly. Instead of being pushed around by other countries.
Wow. That's an exciting prospect.
It is. The future of Europe is really in their hands.
This has been a really thought-provoking discussion.
It has.
I started out feeling pretty overwhelmed by all the challenges facing Europe.
Yeah.
But now I'm actually feeling a little optimistic about their potential.
That's what I love about these conversations.
Me too.
We're not trying to predict the future or give easy answers.
Right.
We're just trying to understand the situation.
And all the different perspectives.
Exactly. And think about the consequences of different choices.
Well, you've definitely given me a lot to think about.
I'm glad.
And I hope our listeners are feeling the same way.
Me too.
It's clear that Europe is at a crossroads.
It really is. This is a make or break moment for them.
And the choices they make will have a huge impact on the world.
Absolutely. So to our listeners out there, we'll leave you with this thought.
Okay.
Imagine a future where Europe is a beacon of unity and strength and innovation.
Okay.
A Europe that confidently charts its own course and helps solve global problems.
Yeah.
And inspires other countries to work together and find peaceful solutions.
That's a future worth fighting for.
It is. And it's within reach.
But it's going to take strong leadership and a clear vision.
And a commitment to shared values.
So keep exploring these issues, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.